He also talks about how key foreign policy issues will be impacted by his possible successors. Hosted by the Hudson Institute, this is an hour and a half.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I also welcome people watching C-SPAN. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute and director of the Centre for European Studies here also. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to a discussion of British politics provoked by a book by our first speaker, Geoffrey Wheatcroft, Yo Blair, which you may remember is a remark that was addressed by the President of the United States to the British Prime Minister at a G8 meeting earlier this year. Now, this remark may not have rung around the United States, but it caused an enormous amount of, I suppose, anger and resentment in England, where it was interpreted, I think not necessarily accurately, as somehow condescending to Mr. Blair. But of course, the reason why it produced such an impact was because there was already a great deal of concern in England about two things. One is the situation in Iraq, and building on that, whether or not the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain was working to Britain's interests. And that was also particularly associated with the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, because he was seen as having established a relationship with Washington in which, and this is the majority view, I think, in England, in which he was adopting too subservient a role. I think that's an interpretation that wouldn't be accepted by everyone on this side of the Atlantic, or perhaps on the other, including perhaps some of our speakers today. Well, I'm going to invite the first speaker, Geoffrey Wheatcroft, the author of Yo Blair, and the author also of a fascinating book on the decline of the British Conservative Party called The Strange Death of Tory England, to begin today's proceedings. After Mr. Wheatcroft, who is a distinguished independent journalist and is the author of and historian and the author of such books as The Landlords, I'm going to invite him to address us on this question. Then I'll invite Christopher Hitchens and Tim Montgomery to respond. Before, I'll just briefly introduce them now. Christopher Hitchens, as they say, needs no introduction. He's well known to Americans and indeed to Brits as the author of a number of books of essays, of literary essays, of political essays, and as someone who in recent years has moved to some degree across the political spectrum, exactly from where to where he might perhaps explain today, but he has taken a strong defense of the Iraq War at a time when many other people were moving in the opposite direction. Tim Montgomery is a former senior aide to the former head of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan Smith, and he's also, and perhaps this will turn out to be a more significant role, the founder and editor of what is the major political blog on the right in Britain, www.conservativehome.com. So both of them approach these questions from positions of both commitment and independence, and I look forward, therefore, to the debate that should follow. Could I begin by asking Geoffrey Wheatcroft to address us?
Thank you, John. And good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's very good to be here and to see you. The title of my book, John has just explained. I had been thinking for some time past of writing a short, vigorous polemic about Mr. Blair, and in particular his foreign policy, and it might have had various titles. It was not inspired by, but there are echoes of a famous book published in 1940 by Michael Foot and two others called Guilty Men, which was an attack on the Chamberlain government before the war. And Guilty Man might have done as my title if it hadn't been for the wonderful title which President Bush presented me with at St. Petersburg last summer. And although I've been told that the phrase is not quite as condescending as some of us in England thought it was, the full transcript of their conversation, which we subsequently read, was hair-raising in the way that it showed Tony Blair really bowing and scraping to President Bush, saying, I can just go out to the Middle East and talk, and I will do exactly your bidding. It did seem to confirm the worst suspicions of most people, and it was a most dramatic moment last summer in Anglo-American relations as well as in international affairs, because the crisis then exploded in Israel and Lebanon, and the Israeli bombardment of Lebanon followed, which was, if you want to contrast statistically between the two countries, the House of Representatives passed a resolution of unconditional support for Israel by 410 votes to 8, at a time when, almost to the day, an opinion poll showed that only 22% of British people thought that the Israeli response was proportionate or justified. I would add, I'll just say for once here, that although my book is thoroughly polemical in tone, what I'm saying here today is, with, I hope, a degree of historical detachment, and I'm not speaking simply as a polemicist. As it were, therefore, whether the Israelis were right or wrong in their response, the objective fact as well was that most British people did not support it, nor did most members of Mr. Blair's parliamentary Labour Party, or indeed most members of his cabinet, but he himself did. And this has been his policy throughout. I think it can be shown that his support for President Bush in the Iraq War stemmed, though no doubt Mr. Blair thought that Saddam was a dangerous tyrant, as who didn't, but I think it can be shown that it stemmed from his commitment to supporting the American administration of the day in whichever decision it took. The most lethal criticism of Blair over Iraq was made by Robin Cook, who had been Mr. Blair's first foreign secretary and was then kicked sideways or downwards, and he resigned. He was the only important member of the government to resign over the Iraq War in March 2003. And in his resignation speech in the House of Commons, he said that the invasion of Iraq would not be taking place if Al Gore were in the White House. Now that, I think, first of all, is obviously true. Poor old Al, as a latter-day critic of the war, discovered an eloquence and passion that had quite eluded him when he was running for president. And what that means is that although the Bush administration could still say yes, and thank heaven, it means, among other things, by the way, that if you want to ask the question who took the ultimate decision to invade Iraq, you could say the Supreme Court. But while the Bush White House could say, yes, thank heaven we had a president decisive enough and brave enough to invade Iraq, Blair can't very well say that. He's in the absurd position of saying, my policy is to support the American administration of the day. I wholeheartedly supported the decision of President George Bush to invade Iraq, just as I would have wholeheartedly supported the decision of President Al Gore not to invade Iraq. He himself is a great believer in the special relationship, and that is my theme here. I believe, again, if one looks hard through the eyes of history, this very phrase is dubious to the point of almost absurdity. It was perhaps a special relationship, special chiefly in that only one side knew it existed, and relationships don't come more special than that. The English loyalty, the British loyalty to the United States has never been reciprocated, and again I emphasize that there is nothing wrong with that on the American side, necessarily. When the accusation is made sometimes of anti-Americanism by critics of Blair's relationship, in particular with President Bush, my answer to that is the United States is a sovereign country. That's the point of the 4th of July. It has its own interests and objectives, which it is entitled to pursue, or as interests as it perceives them at any rate, and which it does pursue, often with a disregard for the interests of its supposed friends, let alone its declared enemies. And this has been exceptionally clear during the period of Mr. Blair's Prime Ministership, and above all in the last 6 years. And the harder one looks at it, the more it seems to me that the so-called special relationship has met its nemesis in this, the events of these few years. To justify it at all, it requires, to begin with, a rewriting of history or a misreading of history. Sir Christopher Mayer, who was the British ambassador in Washington and then wrote a rather gossipy book about his time here in Washington, said that when he was ambassador, he forbade any members of the embassy staff ever to use the expression special relationship. He also said something else. He said that based on his experience as British ambassador in Washington, he came to realize that the White House took seriously the views of the governments of exactly 3 countries, Israel, Ireland, and Saudi Arabia. There is one country missing from that list if one happens to be a British citizen. And he also observed, or perhaps I observed, that you very about the special relationship. There was a most comical exception to that last autumn when Senator John McCain was in England. He came to speak at the Conservative conference, and he then gave a long interview to the Spectator, which is very much an organ nowadays. It wasn't when I worked for it 30 years ago, of Anglo-neoconservatism and of the Anglo-American alliance. And I suppose Senator McCain was being polite and singing for his supper, because he did say how much he believed in the special relationship. And he said, I think this special relationship will last throughout the 21st century. After all, it has already endured for 200 years. At which I said, hello, 200 years back takes us to the early years of the 19th century, or let us say to 1812. What was special about the relationship between the 2 countries that year was that they were at war. I imagine that Senator McCain has visited the White House, and he really ought to know why it's that colour. I mean, some of us take modest patriotic pride, remembering that the presidential mansion had to be repainted after our brave lads had burned it. And I dare say that Senator McCain knows the words of the Star-Spangled Banner as well, and he should remember that it was a British rocket's red glare. And the 2 countries were just as often on very hostile terms throughout the 19th century as they were on friendly terms. They did become allies objectively, and more than perhaps just objectively, in the 2 world wars, although it should be remembered that the United States only entered the First World War belatedly and only took any part in serious fighting in 1918. And likewise, the United States, after an interwar period when the countries were not allies at all, and the United States Army was still making plans, hypothetically, to invade Canada, the 2 countries became allies after Hitler declared war on the United States rather than the other way around, be it remembered. It's an example of Mr. Blair's waywardness with history, to say the least, that he could say, after the September 11 attacks, he expressed the wholehearted support of the British government and people for America, and quite right too. But he went on to say to a grieving New York that my father's generation lived through the Blitz, and there was only one country which stood shoulder to shoulder with us at that time, and that was America. Well, I'm sorry, but the Blitz was the bombing of London and other British cities in the autumn and winter of 1940 to 41, when many other countries, in fact, were fighting on our side, and the United States was neutral. And it shows up the absurdity of this version of history in which the 2 countries have always been intimate friends. And the United States, after all, began life in rebellion against Great Britain. And it has been said by some historians that even in 1914, sorry, just to go back a moment, more Americans would have wanted to join the war at that time on the German side than the British side. We were allies, to be sure, in NATO for 40 years. Well, NATO has lasted longer than 40 years for reasons that escaped some of us, because it was an immensely, brilliantly successful defensive alliance which achieved its objective with total success when not only was Western Europe protected, but in the end the Soviet Union imploded. And I have sometimes wondered why NATO wasn't wound up at that point. But, and this is the thing which defenders of the so-called special relationship and of the present alliance seem to forget, during the period from 1949, when NATO was founded, until 1989, when Russia began to collapse, the 2 countries were bound in this intimate mutual defense pact for the defense of, and if you read, by the way, the founding text of NATO, you may wonder why, how it can possibly justify NATO troops being in Afghanistan today, because it says the North Atlantic area. Anyway, during that period, the 2 countries were intimate allies in NATO, but they were very far from supporting each other's every endeavour outside the NATO area. In 1956, the Americans conspicuously did not support the British and the French in the Suez enterprise, and I would say they were right, and that Eisenhower's criticisms of Eden and his reproaches to Sir Anthony Eden read with not just great cogency, but terrifying topicality today, when he said that if you invade an Arab country, you will arouse animosity not only in the Arab world but throughout the whole of Asia and Africa that will endure for generations. 10 years later, the British did not support the American war in Vietnam. That is to say, Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, expressed sympathy with the Americans, but he did not commit troops. And do remember that that was exactly what the Americans wanted. That was what President Johnson wanted. Very much, very comparably with Iraq, because if you remember, Mr. Rumsfeld said, as the invasion was beginning, that British troops were, with his usual lack of tact, he said that British troops weren't really needed, not for military reasons. As it turns out, he was wrong about that, because very many more troops were needed than he had recognized at that point. But that they were there for political reasons, to show that there was the famous coalition of the willing. Well, in the 1960s, the Americans wanted, in just the same way, other countries to fight in a coalition of the willing, as it might have been called, in Vietnam. And when one English visitor in Washington at the end of that decade was talking to Dean Rusk, who had been Secretary of State, Rusk said to him, all we wanted was one goddamn battalion of the Black Watch. And they didn't get them, although the Black Watch have been fighting, as you will know, in Basra. The final legacy of Mr. Blair's Prime Ministership and of his foreign policy has been to demonstrate the hollowness of this relationship. There is, again, I hope I can be acquitted of anti-Americanism, whatever it means in this context, when I say that any American administration thinks of American interests first. But this has been shown to a quite dramatic degree by the Bush administration. It has been said that the Bush administration's watchword when dealing with its enemies is odorant dum metuant, let them hate us so long as they fear us. But its precept when dealing with its supposed friends sometimes seems to be taken from Prince Schwarzenberg in 1849, when he said, they will be astonished by our ingratitude. When Mr. Blair reacted, as I have said, in my view, absolutely rightly after 9/11 by expressing total support for the United States, his immediate reward was a tariff likely to destroy what is left of the British steel industry. The Bush administration does not appear to believe in gratitude in that respect. And we come, which is where I'll leave it for the moment, to the single most fascinating and ominous moment of Mr. Blair's prime ministership in terms of foreign politics, which was April 2004, when he came to Washington, and when British troops were fighting in Iraq, and when the war had already become grievously unpopular in England, and when Mr. Blair's ostensible reasons for the war in the first place had been shown to be untrue. And if you remember, he was preceded to Washington by Mr. Sharon, the Israeli Prime Minister. And Sharon and Bush cut a deal. Again, I express no views on this of my own as to whether it was right or wrong, but cutting deals is what politicians do. Both of them had something they wanted. Bush, by demonstrating his support for Israel, wanted to carry Florida in the coming presidential election without resorting to quite the baroque means of the previous election. And Mr. Sharon wanted something else. He had decided finally, he who not long before had said that Israel would forever remain in Gaza for Zionist reasons, had finally realized, like most Israelis who got there quicker than him, that the game wasn't worth the candle and that Israel must get out of Gaza, and it was absurd to devote half their military resources to Gaza. But he had to sweeten the pill for his more intransigent followers. And what he wanted and what he got from President Bush was a public statement that with any eventual settlement, and presumably a Palestinian state, there would be no return to the 1967 borders, and that there would be no right of return, as it's called, for the Palestinian refugees from before then. Now, as I say, yet again, the rights and wrongs of this are neither here nor there. This was a total repudiation of existing British policy, which held not that, which didn't take a particular side on either of those questions, the border or the right of return, but insisted that there must be no anticipation of such issues until there was indeed a final settlement. It was also, I think, a repudiation of existing American policy, but that's another matter. And Blair turned up in Washington to be presented with this as a fait accompli, and all he could do was say he saw hope for the future in it. But it was, as even, I may say, his most devoted supporters in London admitted at that time, a total national and personal humiliation. And it was then that a great posse of former ambassadors wrote an unprecedented letter criticizing Mr. Blair, British ambassadors, and which was then, as it were, seconded by Sir Roderick Braithwaite, a former ambassador to Moscow, last summer, when he wrote an article the like of which I'd never seen by a former ambassador, saying that Blair had simply failed to represent the interests of his own country. And it is very hard, I think, for an objective observer of this story to say that Braithwaite was wrong. Blair's policy, which may possibly in some ways have been sincere by his own lights to begin with, has ended up by presenting the country of which he's Prime Minister to the world as a kind of satellite or puppet state. And in my view, that is not good for his country, of which I am a citizen, or for yours, for those of you who are American. And I think that the special relationship, as it has been called, has now run its course, and that under the next Prime Minister, or the one after that, presumably Gordon Brown and possibly then David Cameron, there will be a considerable realignment of British policy. It won't be done in an aggressive way by either man. After all, Gordon Brown was here only the other day and met President Bush for the first time. And David Cameron makes the right noises about friendship with America. But Cameron began last autumn in a very interesting and important speech to detach himself from an uncritical support for American policy. And I think you can be fairly sure that that is what is going to happen over the next few years. Thank you.
Geoffrey, thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Christopher Hitchens, and after him Tim Montgomery, to respond. Then after they both have spoken, I will turn back to Geoffrey and ask him perhaps to discuss some aspects also of the domestic changes that may occur as a result of the change of Prime Minister, and then I'll throw it open to the floor. Christopher.
Sir, ladies, gentlemen, comrades, brothers and sisters, C-SPAN viewers. Wish I'd brought my own book to wave. I didn't think of it, nor did John, rather sadly. Strangely neglected book on the special relationship called Blood, Class and Empire, now available in paperback and at fine bookstores everywhere, which argues against the view much more recently and with much more publicity and panache taken by Andrew Roberts, who has a rather proprietorial attitude towards Anglo-American relations and thinks that they belong in some mystical way to the Anglo-Saxon right wing, that in some deeply layered manner it's a common, almost ethnic and literary inheritance of a conservative kind. My book argues, that actually there are two great paradoxes about the special relationship. One is that it's historically been something that's flourished mainly on the left of centre. I could take a long time justifying this, but I'll condense as much as I can, but it'll, I think, throw some of Geoffrey's remarks into some relief. One of the oldest traditions of the English radical left is an affection for the United States, for the American Revolution, for America as the land of equality, not just of opportunity, but of the franchise, of the opening of land to the landless, the refugee of the persecuted, and the immigrants, the reactionaries of the 19th century spent an enormous time. Charles Dickens's American Notes would be the salient case here, trying to discredit the American Revolution and its British sympathizers. The locus classicus of my case would be something they don't teach you in school, I suppose, the great campaign by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to defend the American Union against secession and slavery in the 1860s, at a time when everyone from the liberal hypocrite William Gladstone to the London Times, to the government of the day, to the cotton and other interests, favored the Confederacy and hoped to build it a navy in the city of Liverpool. If you read The Education of Henry Adams think you'll have to agree, still the classic American memoir and autobiography, you will find that when he was attached to his father's unhappy ministry in London at that period, he found that his only friends were the friends of Karl Marx, and the only friends of the American Union were the English working men's associations. This is a tradition that hasn't been completely buried yet, and I think stands in need of some resuscitation. So I'd stipulate that to begin with. But there's another paradox, as you might say, goes the other way. The reason why you need a special relationship to start off with is the need of the British Empire to disburden itself of colonies that it could no longer afford to pay for or govern or defend. The entire rise to power as an empire of the United States, not the entire, because that would mean exempting the war against the Spanish Empire, but the greater part of the American rise to an unchallenged world dominance is the direct succession that is involved between British governments confessedly saying to Washington that they can no longer stand the strain, and that because of other engagements in Europe, usually with Germany, they require American help, and the price for this will be the transfer of some colonies, perhaps a gold standard or two here and there, and some other responsibilities. If you look at where American troops are currently deployed in the world, and where they've been deployed for a great deal of time, or where they're engaged in the difficulties, that some of which Geoffrey mentions, you will find, whether it's Palestine, Israel, whether it's the Durand line in Afghanistan, Pakistan, whether it's the borders of Iraq, or in innumerable other places I could cite and you could add, these are lines drawn by retreating, ebbing, the long withdrawing roar, if you like, of British colonialism. For the Americans to have picked up this responsibility, so what shall we say, perhaps incautiously, in some respects uncomplainingly, is to give you an idea of how the inequality sometimes goes, if you like, the other way. Churchill and Roosevelt, as you will know, though they're often thought of as the heavenly twins of the special relationship, nobody who's read William Roger Lewis's edition of their complete correspondence can fail to notice Mr. Churchill hated Mr. Roosevelt, and Mr. Roosevelt despised and had nothing but contempt for Mr. Churchill. And it was a race really to see which of these two emotions would get the upper hand. Mr. Churchill did not like the price that was exacted from him for Lend-Lease, did not like being told that the congressional isolationists had to be appeased and the British colonies had to be given up for every tranche of aid in the miserly way that it was handed out at the time, as Geoffrey said, when London itself was being bombed, and when the American ambassador, Mr. Joseph Kennedy, of ill repute and ill fame and unmourned memory, was an open sympathizer of the Third Reich. Very hard to picture a less happy moment than that. The relationship between President Truman and Prime Minister Attlee at the dawn of the Cold War, a great deal warmer and more natural between Democrats and Labour. Ernest Bevin, in fact, signed the NATO treaty with a signet ring that had been given to him. This was Mr. Attlee's foreign secretary. A signet ring given to him as a young man by Samuel Gompers, founder of the American Federation of Labour. That's the British stamp still on the NATO treaty. The post-Labour relationship between Sir Anthony Eden and the United States is probably well known and well remembered as the lowest moment there ever was. The eviction of Britain, France and Israel from Suez by President Eisenhower, his willingness not just to tell the Israelis they couldn't sell Israeli bonds in New York anymore if they weren't out of Gaza by the end of the week, but his openly saying to a British Prime Minister that he would withdraw dollar support for the sterling pound, and willingness to actually do so, is the origin of something that is very little understood on this side of the Atlantic, the extreme hatred of the United States felt by large sections of the British Conservative Party from then on. Muted for reasons of tact and reasons of diplomacy, but very strong and palpable. Mr. Macmillan, the successor of that affair, practically installed in Downing Street by Eisenhower's pressure, had actually a relationship of family with President Kennedy, as well as a sort of avuncular relationship that went beyond that. But it was a fairly tepid business and fairly short-lived, and it founded on the refusal of the United States to take seriously Britain's claim to be an independent rather than a subordinate to American nuclear power. Cantering, I'll keep this canter as short as I can, but I think it's necessary to set the scene. The Wilson-Callaghan Labour governments of the 70s and 60s were immolated, in effect. I would say, immolated morally and politically by their decision that at all costs they had to support the American position in Indochina in return for American support for the sterling area and the price of a highly overvalued pound. When the pound collapsed and when the Vietnam enterprise collapsed also, I think a generation of latent or blatant anti-Americans had been created all across the British media, all across the British academe, all across actually the generation born as I was in the early years of the baby boom. A catastrophe from which neither country has yet recovered. Prime Minister Heath didn't like the Americans, particularly didn't like Secretary of State Kissinger or President Nixon, believed Britain's destiny lay entirely with Europe. Mrs. Thatcher was exactly the other way around, as you know, used the United States to enhance British prestige internationally and as leverage against Europe. Thus, skipping only the contemptible figure of John Major, who managed to be despised all across the United States and all across Europe, in part because he helped to fail Europe's first post-1989 test, the first serious test Europe had to undergo after its reunification after the end of the Cold War. In other words, its utter failure to prevent the recrudescence of ethnic fascism in former Yugoslavia. In Major's case, not even not to prevent it, but to be seconding it, supporting it, endorsing it, helping it. Stepping over that appalling episode, when we come to Tony Blair, we have to acknowledge, whatever else we may have to say, something very important and unique and unprecedented. There had not before been a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom who was neither pro-European nor, in the contra sense, pro-American. Didn't feel he had to choose between the two. Felt at home with both relationships. Was as easy, if you like, taking a holiday in Tuscany as he would have been playing American songs in that rock band of his, or with American culture in general, and of the right generation to be doing all these things. No more playing off Washington against Brussels, Washington against Paris, Washington against Berlin, none of that. But able to know a crisis when he saw one. And also, another achievement, to have been a good personal friend in time of trouble of two very radically different presidents, Mr. Clinton and later Mr. Bush. And when I say standing by them in time of trouble, I make no particular point about whether Prime Minister Blair should have been so fawning on President Clinton when he was caught lying and perjuring and fornicating in the Oval Office and the Lincoln bedroom. I'd rather move directly to September the 11th and the serial consequences of it and say what I mean by in time of trouble, and quote John Howard, the Prime Minister of Australia, who, when accused of being too uncritically or enthusiastically pro-American in the same epoch, and being apparently willing to go wherever America might lead, said in his unmistakable tones, well, there's not much point in being 60% of a friend at a time like this. I thought a very good and useful remark, simple but not completely uncomplicated. Because 60% friendship is not what anybody needs in a time when civil society has been attacked by the most violent and promiscuous form of barbarism to have emerged in this generation's lifetime. So I'm not a bit surprised, doesn't surprise or shock me, I'm sorry to say, Geoffrey, in the least, that Mr. Blair can be overheard speaking soothingly to Mr. Bush in St. Petersburg. That's sort of part of the prime ministerial job, and it's well known that Mr. Bush is a slightly prickly and impatient person. It's much more interesting what Mr. Blair said in public, and he's been criticized much more for what he said deliberately on the podium of his party conference, which were the following words. Shortly after September 11th, he said, addressing our American friends, cousins, comrades, he said, "We were with you with the first, and we will be with you till the last." That surely is what friendship and solidarity actually mean. Sir Christopher Mayer, Geoffrey uses the euphemism gossipy for the tawdry little book that our former envoy here produced on this subject, said that when he heard the words, he began to feel uneasy because he said, words like that have consequences. You might be taken up on them. Well, I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what is the point of making a declaration of unconditional brotherhood and solidarity if you're not prepared to be taken up on it? What's the value of your word? what in fact are your values, if such is not the case. The main sobriquet or epithet that Mr. Blair has reaped for this unequivocal position of friendship is the word poodle. There isn't a child in England who doesn't know how to repeat this childish accusation. Mr. Blair is Mr. Bush's poodle. They hear it from childish adults, they pick it up and they giggle over it themselves. Well, let me just remind you of something. It was not Mr. Clinton or Secretary of State Albright who wanted to finish the job with Slobodan Milosevic and his mad dream of a greater Serbia and an ethnically cleansed and pulverized Balkans, a wave of fascism that would have spread into Hungary and Romania and Transylvania and beyond if it hadn't been, and perhaps into Greece and Turkish relations if it hadn't been contained. It was Prime Minister Blair who urged them to do it and said that British troops would be willing to do it even if American troops were not. This is not poodledom. This is not, I'll underline it, this is not poodledom. Mr. Blair demonstrated the same fortitude in the case of Sierra Leone, went over the objections of almost everybody who thought, well, why not just leave a treaty torn up with an African country, former dependency of ours, founded to protect runaway and freed slaves? Why not let them be overrun by a Liberian invasion run by a group of hand-lopping thugs and irredentists with very strong ties through the diamond and blood diamond racket to Al-Qaeda? Who cares if we don't stand by the treaty? Anyway, it's not worth the life of a British grenadier. Mr. Blair took the view that was not the case, and at the cost of no casualties at all turned the invasion back, greatly, I think, to his credit. In the case of Afghanistan, as we know, he also said to President Bush that British troops were ready to intervene directly, not just by proxy through the Northern Alliance, whether American forces were available or not. But more important still, I think, in showing the puerility of this poodle charge, is the speech he gave in 1999 in Chicago. Actually, it was part of a series of speeches after the removal of Slobodan Milosevic from power. Mr. Blair repeatedly said, at a time when George Bush was the governor of Texas, preparing to run as an isolationist against the interventionism of Albert Gore and Bill Clinton, against the interventionism that Bush denounced and Cheney denounced in the debate, said, you're using American troops for nation building, you can't do that. You're using them for humanitarian purposes around the world. That's not what our 82nd Airborne is for. You're quite wrong. President Clinton and Vice President Gore had repeatedly sworn that there would be another appointment with Saddam Hussein that would have to be kept one time or another. But before that, Mr. Blair had said, we have one dictator down, we have another to go. There's an unpostponable confrontation with Saddam Hussein, and the only question is going to be, does he pick the timing of it, or do we? And just for once, we pick the timing. Up until then, Saddam chose. I know when I'll invade Iran. I know when I'll invade Kuwait. I know when I'll send death squads to hijack tourist boats in the Mediterranean. I know when I'll give sanctuary to the man who blew up the World Trade Center in 1993. I have the initiative here. I can switch allegiance from the PLO to Islamic Jihad and Hamas and pay for the suicide bombings in Palestine to keep the West off balance. I call the shots here. He decided when there'd be a crisis. Now, for deciding that for once we would pick the moment, we have never heard the end, and we never will hear the end from our favorite journalists and clever clogs types. Never hear the end of a campaign of slander and cynicism and defamation, because we produced the necessary evidence, because we said this man is a permanent menace with his genocidal politics, his weapons of mass destruction, his unending support for nihilism and terrorism. It's not just we've waited, we're doing this too quickly, it's that we've waited far too long. And for this, as I say, the campaign of hateful misrepresentation has never, and I think never will, stop. Proof positive, by the way, that history is not always written by the winners. The losers have written this, and I expect they will carry the day in the history books. Thus, I'll end with two ironies. Actually, Mr. Blair probably spoiled everything for the relationship and for himself by being untrue to the principles I've just described. He asked for, after the United Nations Security Council had voted unanimously, including the vote of Syria, to require, on pain of serious consequences, that Iraq, after decades of defiance, come into compliance with the relevant resolutions, not just on weaponry, but on many other things too. A resolution that good legal minds have said, and any moral sense would tell you, was self-enforcing and long overdue, and representing finally the unanimity that any organization of international stature with any vertebrae should have had to feel it had to pass. Syria, not exempted. Mr. Blair said, let's just try this again. Let's have another resolution because I need it for my parliamentary Labour Party. A rather parochial demand, amounting, if you like, to something of a quid pro quo, a political favour of a paltry kind. And because he's not a poodle and isn't regarded as such by the administration, that's another misrepresentation and libel, because they take him so seriously, because British advice is heeded, because British prestige does amount to something, because the Prime Minister is understood as a serious person, he was given what he asked. And therefore the whole noble enterprise of the removal of Saddam Hussein became a matter of nuts and bolts and details and matters of timing, exact locations of sources and methods of terror and WMD, trivializing the whole matter into one of inspections and reducing it to the very banal state in which the argument has declined today. Thus, Mr. Blair undid his cause and himself and his place in history, I think, not by being too much in line with the policy of the United States, correct as it was, but by being not so much so, insufficiently so. Closing irony. Remember what I said about the way the Tories have always hated and resented the loss of their empire and the assumption of those responsibilities that they couldn't discharge any longer, and overlook the empty letters sent by the Arabist dinosaurs of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office who have never got anything right and never will. And note that Jeffrey said that it was last autumn that the little charmer and imposter and publicity specialist David Cameron made a measured statement, taking his distance from the United States. It wasn't last autumn, ladies and gentlemen. It was on the morning of September the 11th that he called his press conference and told the American embassy that he would not be available for any other events. He was going to make his own little declaration of independence as a conservative and to say that from now on this day of all days, the United States could not count on any further British friendship, or could not count on it as an axiom, or could not count on it as a principle. It would from now on have to be bargained for. It would have to be traded. It would have to be quid pro quo. Well, that works for me, and it works for my thesis. It works for my book, because it replaces the virus of anti-Americanism where it always was, where it ought to be, and where it belongs, on the forces of reaction, and with the rump of the British Tory party, whose strange death, as adumbrated by Jeffrey, cannot come quick enough for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Tim, as a leading member of the Conservative Party, those must be fighting words.
It's always strange for me to come to Washington because I end up seemingly always defending Tony Blair in some way, which is how I'm going to start these remarks. Tony Blair, if anyone has devastated my party, the Conservative Party, electorally over the last 10 years or so, it has been him. He has confounded us at every turn, confusing us and defeating us 3 times to a huge extent. So I have no love for the man. No, that's where I start my position and my response to what's been said so far. But I can only agree with what Christopher Hitchens said about this whole poodle myth. It is absolutely ridiculous, and there's no evidence for it if you look at the chronology. It is absolutely true, and Christopher has said what I really wanted to say about this was that if you want a defining text, really, for a lot of what George W. Bush has done since 9/11 through what has gone on in Afghanistan and Iraq, you do have to look back to that Chicago speech. What Tony Blair did was in many ways led the view that the Bush White House has pursued. So it's a very strange kind of poodle that actually wrote the script for a lot of things that have happened since those times. I think the great thing that was missing from all of Geoffrey Wheatcroft's remarks was really the scale of the threat that Western civilization faces at the moment from Islamic fascism. I think there are very few people in England who understand the threat that we all face. Tony Blair is one of them. He understood it right away after 9/11, and I think that is what unites him and President Bush. It isn't some sort of slavish sense that he has to be loyal to President, or loyal to America. I think he appreciates the great dangers that civilization faces. Now, I happen to believe that as Tony Blair has incompetently managed most of the UK affairs since he became Prime Minister in 1997, I think the way the Iraq War has been progressed has been incompetent, and a lot of advice that should have been listened to by defence and foreign policy experts wasn't heeded, not least warnings 2-3 years ago by Senators McCain and Lieberman about the need for many more troops. I make no defence of Tony Blair's competence, but I do think that the idea he's a poodle, the idea that somehow he didn't come to the views that he has independently and first, is simply very, very bad history. I want to focus, I think the subject of the discussion is the future of the relationship between our two countries, United States and United Kingdom. And I think my job, John, is to focus particularly on the Conservative Party's place in that future. And that's what I intend to do for the rest of my remarks. There has been a huge deterioration in the Conservative Party's view of the United States in recent times, and I personally regret that. I think a lot of it is to do with, I think, great failures in the White House, great failures within Team Bush, to realise that there are disagreements between friends, and when those disagreements occur, you work at overcoming them, because there are long-term benefits in the special relationship between our two countries, and special relationships between parties like the Republicans and the Conservatives that need to stand the test of time and need to be worked at. But Michael Howard, the former Conservative Party leader, made some very unfortunate remarks about the Iraq War when, in an interview for the Sunday Times, he said that if he knew then what he knew now, about a little period before the last general election, he would not have voted for the Iraq War. It was a foolish thing for Michael Howard to say, and the White House took great exception to this. There was a lot of telephone traffic between the Conservative Party and the White House, and the White House made it very, very clear that the Conservative Party leader would no longer be welcome at the White House. And that has been a problem in the relationship ever since. There's been no commitment to keep two parties close, the parties of Thatcher and Reagan, etc., that really should be close and standing together on so many important issues. At Michael Howard's right hand at the time he had that White House snub was David Cameron. David Cameron was very much Michael Howard's protege, and David Cameron remembers that slight, remembers the great coldness that began between the Conservative Party and the Bush administration and the Conservative Party at that time. And there's something I would very much agree with what Geoffrey Wheatcroft said. I think the Bush administration has been very bad at maintaining alliances. The steel tariff example he cited was an example where there has been no real effort to keep important friends on side, and I think that's to be greatly regretted. As we look forward, I don't think that the Conservative Party, Republican, Conservative Party, America relationship insofar as a relationship with George W. Bush is going to be fixed, and I don't think there is any willingness in Team Cameron to want it to be fixed. David Cameron, if he becomes Prime Minister, won't become Prime Minister until George W. Bush has left the White House. He is not part of the Conservative Party's calculations, And there are stories that have recently surfaced in the press in Britain of conscious attempts by the Conservative Party leadership to manufacture rows with the Bush White House. The Bush White House is incredibly unpopular in Great Britain at the moment, and the Conservative Party sees tactical advantage in being seen to be at odds with them. This is how far the situation has deteriorated. I report this with no pride. I report it with great disappointment, but I report it as the situation that now exists between the Bush administration and the Conservative Party. This is not to say that the Conservative Party, however, does not want a relationship with America and a positive relationship. Very recently, as has been mentioned, we had Senator John McCain come and speak to the annual Conservative Party conference. It's just been announced that later on this year, the Governor of California will be addressing the Conservative Party conference. The Conservative Party does want to keep a relationship with the Republicans. It wants to keep a relationship open with America. But I think it is important for Americans to understand that it is a different Conservative Party than it has been in the past. It is not the party of Margaret Thatcher. In so many ways, the Conservative Party is becoming much more European in its views, for example, on tax. Team Cameron have largely accepted the European levels of taxation that Gordon Brown has levied on us. It was notable that whereas nearly all of the Anglosphere nations, including Tony Blair, John Howard, Stephen Harper, George W. Bush, sided with Israel during the last summer's conflict in Lebanon, David Cameron was openly critical of Israel, like most of the leaders of the EU and the United Nations. Whether it's the war on terror and, crucially, climate change, the Conservative Party much more now resembles something that is Christian democratic rather than Republican. And I think it's notable that probably the policy change that David Cameron is most known for since he became leader of the Conservative Party has been his support for Kyoto. And I don't think it is any accident that John McCain and the Governor of California are the two Republicans that he's deemed acceptable to come to Britain and that he wants to be associated with. In conclusion, I would say that if the Conservative Party is no longer the party of Margaret Thatcher, it's a different party that America and the Republican Party now has to deal with. I would also say that the Labour Party soon will not be the party of Tony Blair. Tony Blair, I think, has been, I think that the Bush administration has put far too many eggs in the Tony Blair basket. They have very few other good political friends and relationships. In the UK, anybody who wasn't entirely supportive of Blair has been ostracized by them, and when Blair goes, they will find a Labour Party that is much, much more hostile to America. It is a guaranteed cheer line on the fringe meeting of the Labour Party conference last year that if you attack neoconservatism, which is probably the biggest swear word you could use in Britain at the moment, that you would raise a cheer. So I think it is, although I have many disappointments about how the Conservative Party has behaved in recent times, I think that America will find in the medium term that a party which still has people like George Osborne, William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith, Liam Fox, these are Atlanticists. There are many fewer Atlanticists in the Labour Party, and in the long run, the Conservative Party, different as it is now compared to 10, 20 years ago, will be a durable and reliable partner for America in the next stages of what I learned today we're no longer able to call the war on terror. The Labour government has announced today that it's going to, they will no longer be using that expression as a government, but undoubtedly that is what we're still involved in, an age of terror. But I think it will be the Conservative Party that in the long term America will find a more reliable partner in. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. As I said, I would like to just turn to Geoffrey for a moment and ask him, has he got any particular comment to make on the likely domestic consequences, and particularly for the Labour Party, Tim's last point, of the change of Prime Ministership that will take place, I suppose, in about 3 months?
If not sooner. I don't think there will be a drastic change. The domestic politics of Great Britain, from which Christopher is now a little remote, are complex at the moment and quite comical. I mean, the whole of Tony Blair's cabinet are contriving to give the impression that to the last man and woman they were all taking part in an Antarctic expedition when the invasion of Iraq took place, and that it had absolutely nothing to do with them. One after another, they have tried to use various ruses and sleights of hand to dissociate themselves from it, though they can't, of course, quite do so. Gordon Brown is a strong Atlanticist, and in the tradition that Christopher mentioned. I mean, there was never a stronger Atlanticist defence secretary in London than Dennis Healey, who was as fierce an anti-communist as only an ex-communist can be. And there has indeed been a tradition of Labour support for the Atlantic Alliance. I just want to take up a couple of points, if I may, of Christopher's very quickly. You mentioned the Civil War and the undoubted fact that English radicals in the 19th century admired America, and that English reactionaries, as you call them, tended to be more hostile. I mean, there was more perhaps a snobbery, and which persisted indeed in Europe in the 20th century of reactionary and quasi-aristocratic contempt for America. But don't forget the other way around. During the Civil War, the Secretary of State wanted to declare war on Great Britain and was only restrained by President Lincoln himself saying, "I think one war at a time, Mr. Seward." And that after the war, and Christopher mentioned the warships built in Great Britain, one in particular, the Alabama, led to a huge crisis between the two countries. And several senators in Washington thought that the only possible adequate restitution for this, the building of the Alabama in Birkenhead, would be the cession of Canada to the United States. And Robert Kagan points out in his recent book, A Dangerous Nation, about America as an international power in the 19th century, the first of 2 volumes, the second will come up to date, that every leading American, or very many leading Americans from the beginning, believed that the manifest destiny of the United States was to absorb the whole of the North American continent, notably Canada. The point about, I'm sorry, I'm not taking this, these are simply individual points. I'd say one thing about Tim is, of course, on the pro-American wing of the Tory party, and there is certainly an anti-American tradition in Toryism. It's rather died out in between the wars. You could still find it in the old Morning Post, which was the high Tory newspaper, until it folded in the 30s. And more recently, with people like Enoch Powell and Alan Clark on the somewhat idiosyncratic right of the party. But it is interesting to me that every other European country has a right-wing party or a conservative party whose fundamental definition is its dedication to the national interest of that country, and that in my country we have a conservative party, at least one element of which seems to be dedicated to the national interest of another country. I mean, the United States and Great Britain are two, they do not necessarily have the same interest.
Not always, but
sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The point about Clinton, apart from Christopher's reflections on the president's character, is that one friend of mine who knows Blair quite well does say, this is too long a topic to deal with fully, but he says that the most damning thing he regards of all about Blair's conduct was the adroitness with which he switched from Clinton to Bush. But your point about the Clinton administration's hostility to Iraq, which is a point you continually make, was answered by Clinton himself, actually, when he was in London not long ago. He said that indeed it was the policy of the administration to have regime change in Baghdad and also in Havana, but he had not for that reason invaded Cuba. And I don't always quote Clinton with approval, but I think that is a legitimate point. You also mentioned Mrs. Thatcher, and it is true that she formed a very close personal bond with President Reagan, and they had a genuine common interest in pursuing the Cold War to its end, which they achieved with triumphant success, as I have already said. But Mrs. Thatcher was much more detached in some ways from the United States than people realize, or than Tony Blair has been. And I will give you, we were talking about last summer, 2006. Go back 20 years to 1986. Mrs. Thatcher visited Washington. She mentions this briefly in her autobiography, a book with which John is familiar. And but we know we have a more authentic version from the NSC archives. She met George Shultz, the Secretary of State at the time, and gave him the kind of tongue lashing that Parliament and her cabinet and the British people were very familiar with. She said there would be no peace in the Middle East until justice was done for the Palestinians. She wanted to know if the Israeli government regarded the historic land of Israel as its natural territory, and she said that the greatest obstacle to progress was the unconditional support given by the United States to the Israeli government in whatever actions it took. This is Margaret Thatcher. And when that year also the Israelis bombed the PLO headquarters in Tripoli, in contrast to Blair last summer, who stood by the Americans and the Israelis when the Israelis bombarded southern Lebanon, Mrs. Thatcher said she would not endorse this Israeli action. She said we cannot have countries attacking other countries, however vexatious and unpleasant they are, against the normal rules of international conduct. And she said, what would the American response be if I bombed the IRA in Dundalk? And that's a very good question.
But perhaps I can come in on this point, because I actually wrote a book about the Thatcher-Reagan relationship, among other people, recently. Now, it seems to me that one...
Side by side. Christopher's forgotten to bring his.
Okay. Thank you very much. But it seems to me that the fact of that relationship was this, that there were Reagan and Thatcher, representing, it seems to me here, the national interests of both countries very well, saw that they had a common political task to perform, essentially in winning the Cold War. They had differences of opinion, sometimes very serious ones, in the course of that joint campaign. The one that became public was, of course, Grenada. And Grenada became public partly because Mrs. Thatcher, who I think was essentially mistaken on this point, but not on Grenada as a whole, but partly because Mrs. Thatcher was left out of the loop and publicly humiliated, in effect, by the Reagan administration at the beginning of that crisis. But in general, they muffled their disagreements in public, gave each other strong political support in public, having thrashed out their differences in private. And that seems to me to lead on to two other points. One of them is that why is it that Britain has generally, as Geoffrey I think rightly said, has both a state policy and political parties which tend to find themselves more often in alliance with the United States and with some other English-speaking countries, whereas the nationalist or conservative parties in Europe tend to be much more attentive to the narrow short-term interest. And I think the answer is a very simple one, that in the case of Britain, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, these are all countries shaped fundamentally by the same political values. Now, there are differences in those values, I concede, but nonetheless, when you look at the countries shaped by the English language, the common law, tradition of ordered liberty, and so on, they will tend to have an alliance, not based on sentiment, that I agree would be mistaken, but on a similarity of outlook in world affairs, which leads them, therefore, to find themselves generally cooperating with each other. And that leads me to Christopher's point. I must say I was tremendously charmed by his argument that the special relationship was safer in the hands of Karl Marx than it was in the hands of Harold Macmillan, Mrs. Thatcher, and so on. He drew particular attention to the Suez episode, and that was, and Geoffrey did too, that was, I think, the single most important case of Anglo-American breach of relations in which they took very opposite sides. Both Geoffrey and Christopher come together here in taking sides with Eisenhower. I'm actually on Eden's side, as indeed Dulles and Eisenhower subsequently became themselves. And you may remember that if Eisenhower felt that invading an Arab country would lead to generations of hatred throughout the entire world, one wonders why he invaded Lebanon the following year. which he did, and installed a government. Now, the point, however, of I was making here is that look at the biographies of the Suez Group, the most intransigent conservatives on the right over Suez. John Biggs Davidson, Julian Amery, these people were in fact the strongest supporters of America in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, despite the fact that they believed that the United States had been mistaken and misguided in its Suez policy. Why? For the reason I gave before, that they believed that they were shaped by a similar outlook on world affairs, which led them to see the necessity of American actions on a global scale and not to pursue a narrow parochial interest at the time, which I think they would have been doing had they based their policies or their politics on a policy of resentment about Suez for the next 20 years. Well, I'll move on now to questions from the floor and ask who would like to raise the first one. Gentlemen, oh yes, Stephen Morris. Perhaps people could say, where relevant, where they're from and who they are.
Stephen Morris, Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. I'd like the panel to consider the following. In May, we may be at a great historical moment in that in France, we may see the election of the first Atlanticist president in over 50 years, the first solidly Atlanticist president. If that happens, you will see, also in Germany, with Mrs. Merkel, the two major powers of continental Europe in the hands of pro-Atlantic, pro-American governments. Now, from the perspective of whoever is in power in Britain, assuming that, certainly we know that the French presidency is going to last 7 years. I don't know about the coalition in Germany, but let's assume that we're going to have several more years of this, the two continental powers being pro-American. How is it going to create, or how is it going to constrain the options of people like the empty vessels in the Conservative Party you've mentioned, who simply respond to public opinion, by creating an international political or a European political environment which is pro-American? And do you think also that the advent of an Atlanticist hardcore in continental Europe with these two is going to affect public opinion not only in Europe but also in Britain?
Are you addressing that to anyone in particular? Okay, thanks. Christopher first, Geoffrey later.
Well, I must say I think it's an admirable question, and I wish I'd thought of phrasing it that way myself. I mean, implicit somewhat in what both of my confrères have been saying is the idea that friendship with the United States can be considered mainly as a liability these days. I really don't think that's true, and if the British care to drop what has up till then been given to them naturally, so to say, or come to them naturally, they may suddenly find that there are others who are very interested in becoming America's best friend and very eager for what would be, for any European country, of any economic development and political prestige, quite a prize to have, to be America's best friend. I remember very particularly in 1990 going to Aspen, Colorado for a summit meeting between then President Bush the first and Mrs. Thatcher, where there was great depression in the British camp, diplomatically and politically, and in Mrs. Thatcher's own entourage. John remembers it as one of those involved, because it looked more and more as if the United States preferred Herr Kohl and the newly powerful and reunited democratic Germany to the rather fustian traditions of the special relationship. And the first couple of days of the meeting went, in a very depressing way in just that manner. And then we got the news that Saddam Hussein had gone mad and had decided to abolish the existence of Kuwait overnight, to abolish the existence of a member state of the United Nations and the Arab League, discovering in the process that it can be a big mistake to invade an Arab country, by the way, if I might say so. Also a mistake to invade a Persian country, also a mistake to be a fascist megalomaniac and a practitioner of genocide. Other things that ought to lead to condemnation and isolation that don't often get enough emphasis. Well, at once Mrs. Thatcher knew where she stood. Britain has bases in the Gulf, in Oman, for example. It has experience with Kuwait, which it partly invented. It has friends, contacts, it has a navy worth the name, and so on. She could do things immediately for the president that Helmut Kohl could never think of offering. So the moment passed, but I never forgot it. I mean, I'm very amazed that any British Conservative would, though. Yes, you're quite right. The opportunity is there for the taking, and I'm sure Mr. Sarkozy is going to win, and I very much hope that he takes what David Cameron so despises.
Tim, and then Geoffrey, if you want to respond.
Yes, I agree. It's a very interesting question that to have Schroeder replaced first by Merkel and Chirac then by Sarkozy. I agree it's probably going to happen. I think it's interesting that he hides his pro-Americanism on the campaign trail very, very carefully. He knows it's a vote loser, so I wouldn't expect too much in terms of a sort of an assertive or an ambitious support of the American worldview. But yes, the hostility will be absent that has so characterized President Chirac's presidency. The one great worry I have with President Sarkozy is his opposition to Turkey joining the EU. I think the membership of Turkey of the EU is an important sign by the Western world, the developing world, the developed world, Europe, however you want to describe it, that a country with a huge Muslim population that improves its human rights, that democratizes, that behaves in a proper constitutional fashion, will be welcomed by other nations of a Western, more Christian tradition. And I think that will be an enormous tension that he will put at the heart of the West's relationship with Islam if he proceeds on that basis. And I'm afraid a lot of why he takes that position is I fear for a lot of the anti-Islamic sentiment that is now very strong in Europe, and if not managed well, presents all sorts of problems in the future.
Thank you. Geoffrey.
Yes. I'm sorry, I'm so absorbed by what Tim was saying that I've forgotten what I was going to say before that. This question of sorry, your question. I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. I'm not sure I accept the premise, by the way. First of all, the assumption, therefore, that Nicolas Sarkozy is devoted to Atlanticism. I think that, to borrow from Dorothy Parker, the only ism Nicolas Sarkozy believes in is opportunism, and that he has been making one noise one day and another the other day. And, one day he condemns the black and Arab rioters as, well, it was in the English-speaking press it was called scum. It was actually racaille, which is rabble. And the next day he says that we must understand them and be nice to them. Do not at all exaggerate any turn, I would suggest, in European politics in this respect. Yes, Sarkozy and Merkel are conservatives, and they don't want to play on the visceral anti-Americanism of a certain part of the European left. But neither of them supported or would have supported the Iraq War. There is scarcely any leader of any important European country who did so or would have done so, apart from Blair and Berlusconi. And one should be very careful of thinking that there is, I hope that there will be, in some respects, warmer relations between the European Union and the United States, but don't count too much on that. And there are two things I think I can just knit together here, going back to something Christopher said much earlier about the way that the Iraq War began and Blair's mistake in his view of trying to get a second United Nations resolution. And Christopher mentions almost disdainfully the Parliamentary Labour Party. Well, I'm sorry, this is what's known as democracy. I mean, Blair took his country into a war against the wishes of most of his own MPs, if they had been honest, most of his own cabinet, if they had been honest, and most of the citizens of that country. And it is, to borrow your word, irony, it is the supreme irony that ostensibly to bring democracy to Mesopotamia and the larger Middle East, democracy was very badly damaged where it already existed. In my country, which gave the world parliamentary government, and this country, which gave the government, the world government of the people, by the people, for the people. The fact that the Parliament could be manipulated and in some ways bamboozled in supporting a war against its real wishes, a contrast indeed to 1914 and 1939, when a reluctant government, British government, was pushed into war by parliamentary and public opinion. It was completely the other way around in the case of Iraq, and the only resemblance...
The second resolution is the manipulation.
Well, there was a vote in the House of Commons, of course, in which the Conservative Party supported the government.
Yes, to their subsequent regret, many of them. But anyway,
Well, come on, he had a majority in Parliament already. It was a sop to his own party, which is a rather undignified way of making war.
But let me just turn from
Or
this question. Let me just very quick. All right, let me just very quickly deal with that because you see, somebody whose position on the war was similar to Christopher was Michael Ignatieff, who was one of those known as liberal hawks, and he wrote a piece in the New York Times about a year after the invasion of Iraq in which he said that he had been dismayed and discomposed by the failure to find so-called weapons of mass destruction because he believed the claims made in the first place. Some of us weren't discomposed or dismayed because we never had believed claims made. He then went on to say something which I think Christopher would echo. I don't want to put words in your mouth. He said, in hindsight, to be honest, the proper case for the war was not for a preemptive war to disarm a dangerous tyrant who possessed mass destructive weapons, but a preventive war to depose a dangerous tyrant before he could acquire such weapons. Now, I take that point entirely. May I take it that that is roughly what you would say too?
Said then, yes.
Yeah,
Mr. Ignatieff has now retreated to Canada, you'll notice, which is as yet unconquered by the United States.
As yet, don't put any ideas in the head of
Our day will come.
I think we need to move on to the next question.
Let me just find
So you must be very quick.
Because Ignatieff said that, and I took the point. He then went on to say glumly, unfortunately, for my side in the argument, if the honest case of preventive rather than preemptive war had been made, the war would have been even more unpopular than it was. Quite so. I take that point. Now, get back to the next question. Next question.
Good too.
The next question from the front. Thank you for taking a firm hand on
Senior fellow Discovery Institute. The Scottish parliamentary elections, I think, are Scottish parliamentary elections coming up. If they elect a Scottish Nationalist Party, what chance do you see that they will vote to secede? And if so, what is the impact on British politics and the British-American relationship for anyone on the panel?
I think we'd probably begin with Tim and come this way.
I think the Scottish Nationalists will do very well next month. They will not get a majority. All opinion polls suggest that they will be the largest party, but they will fall short of the majority. They are, of course, the Scottish National Party, and they believe in independence, but they have said that they won't want actually a referendum on independence for 3 more years after the Scottish elections, because actually a lot of the opinion poll evidence suggests that it actually is one of their least popular policies. Some polls have recently put support for independence at 50%, but others as low as 30%. The view, I think, is of most commentators, the vote for the SNP is largely a protest against Labour. The Iraq War is one of the major reasons why the Scottish Labour Party's fortunes have declined so much. But I think it would be a misreading to believe that a vote for the SNP was a vote for independence. I think when the weight of the main unionist parties, Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrats, is put behind a no vote should that independence vote happen in 3 years, Scotland will stay part of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Geoffrey.
Yes, I'm surprised and pleased to hear the question brought up. We're about to have the most fascinating week in British politics for a long time. Tuesday the 1st of May is the 300th anniversary of the Act of Union between England and Scotland. Wednesday the 2nd of May is the 10th anniversary of Tony Blair's Prime Ministership, and Thursday the 3rd of May is the local elections in England, in which Labour look like doing very badly, and the Scottish elections, in which the SNP seems certain to become the largest party because they have proportional representation. They'll have a plurality but not a majority. Unlike Mr. Blair, by the way, who at the last British general election won 54% of parliamentary seats with just over 35% of the popular vote.
Move nearer the mic.
I'm sorry. And finally convincing me of the need for some kind of electoral reform. I don't think it's likely that there will be an independent Scotland in the foreseeable future, but it has shown up. The SNP's position over Scotland is entirely coherent and intellectually honest. They want independence. Labour, on the other hand, was a belated, reluctant and completely insincere convert to devolution, and it was nothing more than a political manoeuvre on the part of Labour under Tony Blair as it came about, because what Labour were trying to do was to square a circle politically by holding off the electoral challenge from the Scot Nats. Within Scotland, while at the same time keeping as many as possible of Labour's Scottish rotten boroughs in the Westminster Parliament, without which Blair could not now hold power. It may not have been noticed here that at the last British general election, May 2005, the Tories won the largest number of votes in England, not the largest number of parliamentary seats, but they did win the largest number of votes, and they will, I think, without any question, I would have a large bet that whatever happens at the next general election, the Tories will win the largest number of seats in England, and then there is going to be a severe constitutional crisis, in my view. Or I don't know that, as I say, whether it will be that there will be a new Scotland, a new independent Scotland, although Alex Salmond, the leader of the Scottish National Party, has said recently, rather interestingly, that he doesn't want to, he wants England to be Scotland's best friend and vice versa. He doesn't want to have a separate currency, and he doesn't even want to leave the monarchy. And this suggests to me heading towards an Ausgleich, like 1867 and the creation of the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, but we'll see.
Do you want to come in, Christopher?
I'd just say, as de Gaulle said about the greatness of Brazil, that it's always something in the future, and that's where it will remain. The independence of Scotland and of Quebec are just exactly like that. The people involved don't have the nerve to do it, for one thing, or the guts. And they also know that the consequences will be greater than they are ready to reckon with. First, sub-secession. There are lots of people in Quebec who'd want to leave in different directions if they had to be governed by the heirs of Pétain and Poujade, and the same would be true of Scotland. And the other is they would complicate hugely their relations with the European Union, which is the only reason they have enough prosperity to be getting on with to begin with. And it's by no means a certainty. It seems to me that an independent Scotland can count on staying within without having to reapply and perhaps have to take another look at itself in the mirror. So it's a false issue. It just won't happen.
Thank you. Now, this will have to be the final question, I'm afraid. Is there one? Yes, the gentleman in the second row.
Stanley Koger with the Cato Institute. I'd like to pursue this question of friendship. I can understand that loyalty is a manifestation of friendship, but isn't honest criticism also an act of friendship? Just this morning, I heard General McCaffrey speak a block away on the war in Iraq, reporting on a trip he made there. The retired four-star general, now at West Point. And in his trip report here that was distributed, he says, and I'm quoting, "In summary, the U.S. armed forces are in a position of strategic peril," unquote.
I'm very sorry, what was the word?
Strategic peril.
Peril.
If somebody tries to warn you against putting your armed forces in a position of strategic peril, is it that an act of friendship also?
I'm going to ask our three speakers to answer the question, starting with Tim and coming this way, very quickly as possible, if you would.
I think I don't agree with the sort of criticism of the Iraq War, but I do think honest criticism is important. I think there are many cases where this relationship is stronger because of honest criticism. I think there is a mischaracterization of what Geoffrey Wheatcroft says, that somehow Blair's position has been poodle-like. I don't think he has answered the charge that actually Blair's analysis of the need for liberal interventionism actually preceded Bush coming to power. And I think there are a number of examples of actually Blair having affected US policy by being engaged with them and being critical behind the scenes.
Christopher.
I was asked in, I think, early October 2001 if I'd like to come to the memorial service for I think it was about 400 British citizens who'd been murdered at work in the World Trade Center a few weeks before, and I said, no, I don't want to come to a special service for Brits, and I wish you wouldn't have one. And I don't think this is an attack on America, and I think the President is wrong to describe it as that. And I think that Tony Blair is quite right in saying that we stand with the immediate victim, in this case the United States, because we recognize it as an attack on civilization. So I don't think that's a distinction without a difference, do you? So it's not a matter of loyalty or friendship, it's a matter, I would prefer to say, of solidarity. And it means, Geoffrey says, what's NATO doing in Afghanistan? Well, look, the answer to that is its charter says if one member is attacked, all respond. That's why. Now that seems to me what solidarity means literally and ought to mean in this case.
Thank you. Geoffrey.
Yes, of course I think that that true friends are candid friends, and that the best, since I think the Iraq War was a mistake, neither of my friends on my left agree with that, or indeed John. But for once, I'm not in a minority, except on this platform, because the view that the Iraq War was a mistake is now shared by the great majority of Americans and of British people. And I think that that Americans who continue to admire Tony Blair, as quite a lot do, might bear in mind that he was pretty well the only person on earth who might have been able to stop the Iraq War. If you think that the Iraq War has been a brilliant achievement, then you should certainly salute Mr. Blair. If not, then not. And as my closing remark, because this has been cited so often by Christopher and Tim and others, that is to say the 1999 Chicago speech which Tony Blair gave, the central text of liberal interventionism, and it was a very good speech indeed, in many ways, not surprisingly, since it wasn't written by Mr. Blair. The crucial point of that speech, it was written by Sir Lawrence Freedman, I should say, he said this, these are the words: we must examine the conditions before we take military action. First, are we sure of our case? Second, have we exhausted all diplomatic options? Third, on the basis of a practical assessment of the situation, are there military operations we can sensibly and prudently undertake? Fourth, are we prepared for the long term? In the past, we have talked too much of exit strategies. And finally, do we have national interests involved? That is very well put. And 8 years later, I would say, were all of those conditions met in the case of Iraq, or indeed was any?
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to draw this debate to a close. I think, if we're honest, and I suspect you will share this feeling, there have been times during the debate when we would have been rather depressed. But the fact is, it was a very honest reflection of some of the debates and discussions and trends that are currently taking place within Britain and in British politics. And Americans should know that this is the case. Secondly, I personally, and this may not be universal, felt at times that resentments were playing too large a part in our discussion of attitudes across the Atlantic in both directions, principally the British towards the American. Of course, there have been times in the last 200 years, Geoffrey mentioned the War of 1812, when the two countries were injuring each other, and they are not going to be forgotten, nor by historians should they be forgotten. But nor should they necessarily dictate future attitudes and future policies. And there is a temptation always that this should be the case. I think it's been a temptation that since the settling of the Venezuelan crisis by determined British appeasement by Lord Salisbury in 1895 has been resisted. The British have gained a great deal from deciding not to pursue their interests, their national interests, to the against the United States in that particular conflict. And for the next 100 years, there has been a close relationship between the two countries. That relationship has been based, it seems to me, on real long-term interests of both. At the moment, that is not how it is seen in Britain, it's fair to say, and I think Geoffrey is giving us an accurate depiction of British opinion here. But then I remember a very important point made by Christopher in the course of the debate. He described the situation very accurately when Mrs. Thatcher and people in Downing Street felt that the Americans were, in a sense, rejecting the special relationship in favor of a new special relationship with Germany after Reagan had left office, and I think partly to distinguish the Bush administration from the Reagan administration and in its relationship with Mrs. Thatcher. But of course, Kuwait came along, and all of a sudden it was more convenient and a better expression of American interests to return to the special relationship. Now, at that time, Mrs. Thatcher did not follow a policy dictated by resentment at the treatment she had been receiving for the previous year. She saw an opportunity to advance British interests and also to repair an alliance which had never really been shaken or shattered, but merely damaged at the margins. And as a result of that, a very successful policy was carried out. I think that overall, we have to say that the relationship that was in a sense, begun in 1895, solidified in 1941, and triumphant in 1989, 1991, is one which you can never count out. And at the moment, although at the moment it is unfashionable in British politics, the long-term national trends in both countries will, I think, make it live again. I realise I'm giving an editorial opinion here and not expressing my thanks to the board, but I now ask you all to thank them for a lively and vigorous debate. Thank you. Thank you very much.
One rarely forgets about it.
So everyone was waiting. Kipling wanted to go to war with America.
No, but it was said at the time that most Kipling was an exception, but most English people of the war, it was said, viewed the idea of war with America with horror as a fratricidal war. But that in America, a war with England would have been the most popular of all wars.
It was very popular.
Our Road to the White House coverage